Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. My returning guest today is John Michael Greer. As many of you know, he is a renowned author, occultist, and teacher with decades of experience in the esoteric arts. He has written extensively on a very wide range of topics indeed, including tarot, astrology, druidry, and so much more. And he is a wealth of knowledge and insight. In today's episode, we delve into two fascinating topics: the work of his tarot teacher, John Gilbert, and a little bit on the practice of mundane astrology. We begin today by discussing John's recent work, The Doors of Tarot, which collects and preserves some of the teachings of his late mentor, John Gilbert. John shares stories about his personal connection to Gilbert, his teacher's innovative approach to tarot, which I really enjoyed in the book, and how Gilbert's philosophy of focusing on single card readings has influenced his own approach to divination in general. Later in the episode, we shift gears a bit to talk about mundane astrology, astrology applied to larger world events and economics. John provides some fascinating insights into what he sees in current astrological charts for the next few months in the United States, and helps us to understand a bit about how those celestial movements influence our collective experience. Before we dive into this wonderful conversation, I'd just like to remind my listeners about the fact that my co-high priestess of our coven, Denise Crucy, and I will be presenting at the Sacred Space Conference in March of 2025 here in the US. That is a really incredible gathering of spiritual practitioners and teachers, and tickets are available, and you can find details on that in the show notes. As always, if you enjoy this episode, please consider subscribing to the podcast, leaving us a 5-star review, which is always super helpful, and sharing it with friends who might love exploring these arts and enjoy the show. You can always find me on Instagram at Coffee and Divination for updates and more. So now, let's dive in. So thank you everyone for tuning in and listening. It is obviously my honor and my pleasure to have back on the podcast John Michael Greer. I've already told you a little bit of his intro, though I'm sure he really needs no introduction for most people listening to this. And therefore, I'll just say thank you so much for being here again.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure.
Well, we are here today to talk about a number of very exciting topics. And the one that I wanted to center around to start is a book that you edited that came out last year. Um, all centered around the works of John Gilbert, his works, and particularly the one that I have read recently is The Doors of Tarot: Lessons for the Practical Diviner. So for those people who are unfamiliar with who he was, could you perhaps give us a little introduction to him and
Sure.
what his connection to tarot really is?
Okay. John, well, I mean, probably most people are still unfamiliar with John Gilbert. He was never particularly famous. He never went out of his way to court publicity. And in particular, although several of us tried to talk him into taking some of his lessons and so on and turning them into a book, we could never get him to do that. That had to wait until after he passed away. At any rate, he was born in South Dakota. He spent a while in the Coast Guard and then became a school teacher and ended up in Colorado, where he became a student of several influential figures in the local occult community. Dr. Juliet Ashley, who had been a personal student of Edgar Cayce and also of Manly P. Hall, and had been underfoot since the 1920s, I think, in the American occult community. And Matthew William Shaw, who was a dissident Universalist minister who had left the Universalist Church, where he had originally been a clergyman in Pennsylvania, and became a Gnostic bishop. And he ended up in Colorado, and he and Juliet Ashley were friends. I don't know how far their relationship went, but they were certainly friends and associates, and they were the most important of John's two teachers. So he just toddled quietly along. There was this little clutch of old-fashioned occult orders in the Denver, Boulder, Colorado area. Back during the 1960s and 70s, when it was when Wicca was all the rage, and people were not too interested in orders, these old traditional, rather stuffy orders that had people keep their clothes on in ritual and so on. Um, there was just this little group that mostly ended up with all the same people attending half a dozen different organizations, and they ended up with a storefront. I think it was in one of the small towns between Denver and Boulder. That on Mondays it was the Order of Spiritual Alchemy, and on Tuesdays it was the Modern Order of Essenes, and then Thursday was the Druid meeting, and Friday was something else, and Sunday was the Universal Gnostic Church. Uh, but it was all the same people, and John studied with all of them, and he ended up being more or less the last man standing. For a while, in the first decade of the century, he made an effort to try to get some of the teachings out um, by way of the internet. He had students. That's how I ended up in. Well, that's part of how I ended up in contact with him. He was also, from way back, a tarot reader. He actually made a fair amount of money that way, doing tarot readings for people, and he was, among other things, seriously the best tarot reader I've ever seen. We'll get into some of the remarkable things that he did as we proceed. But yeah, he had just a sort of small scene, mostly online, and I studied with him. I talked with him on the phone a fair amount, and I corresponded with him by email constantly. We only actually met in physical space maybe half a dozen times, largely, so that we go to events together, and he'd arrange to pass on some initiations to some of us. But yeah, so he passed away in 2021, of at quite an old age, and he had made basically no arrangements for anyone to pick up his legacy and do anything with it. So I talked to his widow, and she was quite eager to see the material passed on, and the two books that I did with Eon Books, that I edited, of his papers and so on. That's part of that process. So that's kind of the short form of John Gilbert.
Yeah, no, he sounds like he must have been an absolutely fascinating person to talk to, and we have a lot to thank him for because he was also associated with you with the Ancient Order of Druids in America, right? So there
Yeah,
was
that
that connection.
yeah,
Yeah,
that was one of those
one
one of
of
those
those.
orders that he was associated with. It was the one that I went looking for. Although I actually met him first at an American Tarot Association conference. Um, and it's a long, complex story. But yeah, he was an extremely interesting guy, very gentle. He had been physically abused by a parent when he was a child, so he had that he did not go as some people who go through that experience. He did not become an abuser in his turn. He became very gentle and put a lot of energy into helping victims of abuse in various ways throughout the course of his life.
Yeah.
But yeah, he was a very special, very interesting person to know. And unfortunately, very poor at organization, or some of the teachings he had would be much more widely distributed.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. That's
Yeah.
from the book that I've read so far, it's absolutely fascinating, and I can that comes through in how you've edited his work, and
hmm
that is beautiful to read. What would you say about his philosophy specifically of tarot and the way that he looked at tarot that drew you to want to kind of correspond more with him and regarding tarot?
Okay. Well, the first thing that really struck me about his tarot practice is that he was the master of the one card reading. You'll often see tarot readers who will lay out cards, practically fill the table with cards, or at least they'll do the Celtic cross with 10 cards and this kind of stuff. You would ask him a question, he would draw a single card and put it down and proceed to tell you everything you needed to know about the answer, including details you hadn't told him. He was better at that than anybody I've ever seen. It was unnerving. One card readings were his specialty. So that in itself, kind of a doing more with less, was something I found very striking. One of the other things that I found very interesting is that he refused to take part in any of the endless squabbles about, well, what does this card mean, or what does that symbol mean, or what does that suit mean. He felt that the tarot was kind of a mirror by which you can talk to your own unconscious mind. And so It's not that the cards mean something fixed in any sort of any sort of universal sense. It's that you and your unconscious negotiate between yourselves what each of the cards means. And so he had this very open, very all-embracing, very flexible approach to teaching tarot. That, among other things, made him an extremely good teacher. It kept him out of a lot of squabbles, but it also I know I've watched any number of times where he would do a 1-day class in tarot, and people would come into the class with a deck that they had no idea how to read. They were just eager, and by the time the day was over, they could do readings and get accurate results. So that was one of the other things that made me go, okay, there's something very special here, something in this
Mhm.
very flexible, very simple philosophy of tarot as a mirror of the deep mind that I thought was very striking, and that made me very much focused on getting his tarot material out into circulation after he had passed.
Mhm. No, I think I could see that walking through the first few chapters of that book and seeing how he could absolutely, with something as straightforward as his system, help someone
Mm.
kind of
Yeah.
go to something that can be as overwhelming as that many number of cards with pictures and numbers and
Hmm.
symbolisms, and yet be able to lead them through having one phrase or at least a few words to
Hmm.
group things by. And at the end
Hmm.
of the day, say, I know these categories, these groups of cards mean this, and
Hmm.
that's it, which I think is incredibly succinct and very uncommon in most
Hmm.
tarot literature, as amazing as it is, of course. And
Hmm.
he
Hmm.
one of the things in that chapter, he talks about sort of segmenting, and he walks readers through the ideas that he links. I mean, obviously, numerology is a part of his system, which I figure we
Hmm.
will maybe talk about now or a little bit later. But so he kind of groups things by numbers and assigns them to sort of concepts and ideas that
Hmm. Hmm.
walk someone through the ideas that a child or an adolescent or an adult would sort of use to look at and experience the world. It's a
Hmm.
little tricky to try to synopsize that, but is there some way that you could maybe talk about that idea of segmenting the tarot and how he was doing that for
Hmm.
people?
Well, just very basically, if you have a mess of 78 cards, and you have to try to sort them out one by one, it's going to be very confusing and take you a long time. But the tarot itself is segmented. You have 4 suits. Okay, you have 4 suits plus the trumps. So each one of those is a segment. Each one of those, whether it's swords and or wands or cups or pentacles or trumps, each of those is segmented into categories. Each of those within them, you have the numerology. So you have the numbers as basic segments. So all of the ones mean something, all of the twos mean something. It is, among other things, a very easy and effective way to sort of break things down. There's less to memorize, and thus more that you get past that and get to the point where you can start using your intuitive capacities to have those basic terms, to assign a word, for example, to each of the suits, to assign a word to each number, and then to figure out how to just get used to joining them together. It gets you past the early stages.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate the kind of concreteness of that
Hmm.
type of system. And while numerology may not be something that people not everyone associates very strongly with if they don't have an experience with it.
Hmm.
I like how it struck me as similar to something that Camellia Alias sometimes says, which is, one is a little, 10 is a lot. Like it's about seeing what is on
Hmm.
the card and associating the number appropriately with something, but you don't have to
Hmm.
overcomplicate it.
Hmm.
So numerology doesn't
Yeah.
have to be extremely complicated. Sometimes it is just what is on the card. How does that relate to, is it well,
Uh-huh.
is it full?
Hmm.
Is
Hmm.
it so there's that aspect as well.
Well, one of the things that gave John an advantage here is he was also an extremely good numerologist. I I had actually come to, when I started studying with him, um, I have a habit with any oracle, any divinatory method. I try it out on myself and see whether it makes any sense. And there
Yeah.
are some things that have made, the first time I tried tarot, I started immediately getting meaningful answers. I'm going, okay, this is serious. But I had a bad time with numerology, mostly because it had been badly explained to me. And so I came in with a kind of a skeptical, okay, yeah, right. And that was one of the things that John rather changed my opinion of. He was
Hmm.
an extremely good, and he had, as you'd expect for John, he had a somewhat simpler system. Okay, he would use the number derived from your birth date to tell you, okay, this is what's fixed in your life. This is the stuff. This is your karma. This is the situations in the environment that you will have to deal with all through your life. Okay,
Hmm.
and here's your name. That's the thing you can change. You can always change your name. And so that deals with the potentials, that the things that you yourself bring to the equation, and you can alter as you wish. Then the combination of the two gives you a sort of how this is going to likely to work out. And that's also the number that you add to the date every day to give you a day number, which allows you, each day. For example, today is a 4 day for me, so it's kind of four-ish. It's kind of square and a little trudgy, but it'll work.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so yeah,
Yeah. And
he was. It's some of these numerological systems. I'm thinking of Matthew Goodwin's, which I've studied since then. Very accurate, but oh my God, it's complicated.
yes, sometimes they can get what I think is overly complicated, but the
Oh
way
yeah,
that he explains it in the book is extremely straightforward, and I think makes it very workable, even if it is
yeah,
not something that consider one of your specialties. It does. It's a very
exactly.
excellent description.
Yeah, you can pick that up, and one of the reasons I think he tended to focus a lot of attention on numerology and taught it to all of his students is that then ties into the tree of life, which is also the numbers 1 through 10 and so on, and into various of these other aspects of the spiritual traditions that he dealt with. He doesn't really make a lot of fuss about the tarot, as in this book, in the materials that I gathered in this book, as an initiatory device, but it can be that, and he was very much open to that. Okay, let's take the divinatory side, let's get good at it, and then let's start noticing how what doors this opens. He did the same with numerology, with astrology, with various other things.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so the simplicity is, it is very much meant for the beginner, for somebody um, who either has not done tarot before, or who is frustrated with it, has read books that made it seem just ungodly complex, and needs something a little simpler, a little more basic and more direct, that will enable them to put this to use and get accurate readings.
Yes, and I think obviously he does emphasize that the one card reading, which I really love, and I think there's something that he said that there's nothing worse than a bad Celtic cross reading, which I absolutely agree with. Um, when you just
Well,
either you're just
I
laying out so many cards that it makes no sense, or you have these complex reading patterns. But if you're not able to
mhm.
actually do anything with that,
if
there's nothing
if you
worse.
can't summarize it, I do have to say there is one thing worse than a bad Celtic cross reading. If you've ever dealt with the Golden Dawn um, system, they have this hyper complex object called the opening of the key, which uses 5 separate layout patterns, and it's I don't know anybody. I have never met anybody who could actually make it work well. I've met some people who through heroic efforts could get some meaning out of it, but it's just way over the top. But the one card reading, well, one of the things that John and I talked about, one of the prejudices, or the bees in our bonnet that we shared, there was for a long time there in the late 20th century a real tendency for people to take tarot in a very mushy kind of way and do every reading as, well, what do you want it to mean, in effect? And this made the clients feel better, but it didn't necessarily give them any useful information at all. And so one of the things that he really prided himself on was that he could give you a straight answer. It was not, well, I'm going to mumble around and give you some ink blot patterns onto which you can project your desires. You're going to ask this question. I'm going to give you a yes or a no. I'm going to say, well, that's going to work, or no, you're going to run into some serious problems here. When you deal the Ten of Swords, this does not mean, why, sure, you can go right ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, that is one thing that comes across very clearly, because what I like is he gives a lot of examples of, the
Hmm.
ways that when he's explaining each of these concepts, he's giving examples of, here's a question someone asked, here is my answer, here's why.
Hmm.
And none of them are long. And yet at the same time, it's extremely to the point, and you can see how it connects to what he's been saying in the previous paragraph, but
Hmm.
he's using a lot of very clear and sometimes, difficult questions. He doesn't shy away from that, even from
Yeah.
an ethical standpoint, although that's a separate question of, how he talks about the ethics of it. But that clarity of being able to say, yes, we will give people straight answers that don't need either six more cards to explain it, or, to become lost in a mush of words.
Hmm. Hmm.
However, one of the things that I kind of want to go back to something that you brought up earlier, and that certainly
Hmm.
he emphasizes in the book, in his writings, or how you have edited his writings. This idea that what you decide the card means is what it
Hmm.
means. I
Hmm.
absolutely love the clarity of the explanation that he gives, and I can see how it works beautifully. There's much about that I completely agree with. However, it's
Hmm.
something that I enjoy thinking about and kind of wrestling with, because
Hmm.
as a polytheist, the idea that these cards connect to larger spirits that are not just our
Hmm.
subconscious,
Hmm.
since
Hmm.
I'm not thinking of them as simply mental archetypes, shall we say, but as something that
Hmm.
has personhood outside of the self. It was
Hmm.
interesting to me to think about that, and then I'm curious about what your opinion is on that.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is one of the places. John was fairly cool about the fact that he and I did not agree on everything. Um, I think that it can be useful to as a teaching device and as a way to avoid endless, either endless petty squabbles or endless meltdowns. Oh, but do I have the right meaning for this card? To use as a first approximation, the whole it means what you decide it means. In the deeper sense, of course, well, as Jung pointed out, the archetypes do not mean what you want them to mean.
Mhm.
Archetypes
Yes.
are autonomous. Archetypes have their own agenda, in effect. They have their own inherent meaning, and it doesn't matter what you think. They mean what they mean. The trumps, certainly, each of those has archetypal force, and I think, in my experience, certainly, a lot of people will start out saying, "Well, I'm going to decide what they mean," and then, through the experience of doing readings and getting feedback on them, you start to realize that the cards mean what they choose to mean, and you end up interacting with them. Again, it becomes a conversation. It's not just you dictating to what's ever on the other side of the card. The cards themselves have something to say. They have a vote in the matter, and so I would say it's as with so much, it's a matter of co-creation. You and the intelligences behind the cards are having a conversation, are working this out between you. Just parenthetically, one of the things that I emphasize in my own teaching is that if you're going to learn any kind of divination, the best way to do it is to cast a reading every day for what's going to happen this day. What can I expect during the day to come? And then check it that night or the next morning. Check your work. Very quickly, you'll start learning when specific cards or specific runes or specific what have you, when they're communicating something specific. You'll go, oh, that's what the chariot means. Because
Yeah.
every time
Oh,
the
absolutely.
chariots come up in the last 3 months, I've had such and such happen. Okay, again, it becomes a conversation. It becomes a co-creative process.
Mhm.
And John was very open to that, but it was not something he put out there for beginners or even early intermediates. He wanted to avoid the quarrels, and he wanted to focus on just get past that. Don't worry about whether you have the right meaning. Just choose a meaning and work with it, and then let it evolve as experience manages.
No, I think that's brilliant, and also it avoids the potential to just overthink and avoid the doing in the in the time of
I,
saying, well, I
hmm.
won't do until I've figured out, who I'm talking
Hmm.
to, or exactly how to do it. So then you never actually get
Oh
to
yeah.
the doing part. So yes.
Yeah,
Um,
well, that's funny that I'm laughing because um, one of the divinatory methods that I teach fairly often is geomancy. And the great reason why people get inaccurate geomancy readings is they overthink them. In fact, that
Mhm.
very word, you're overthinking it. I say that all the time. So
Yeah.
I'm beginning to think that maybe one of the basic problems that students have in divination. I'll have to get a large rubber stamp that says "Don't overthink it." Go on.
Yeah, so you just can use the stamp and there you go.
Just whomp. Yeah. Well, it's better. That's probably more merciful than like a branding iron or something.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think that that's also kind of possibly because due to our fallibility as humans, we have to really have a belief that we have, because of the nature of how we live and what we do
Mhm.
in these bodies, we
Mhm.
have to have thoughts about our own control over the situation. And that's
Mhm.
necessary for us to be able to go along and do what we need to do in life. But at
Mhm.
the same time, it is more of a co-creation and coming to understand that in a lived body sense of saying like,
Mhm.
oh, I see this is actually co-creation because you've been in the act of doing it and you sort of discover it as you go along. Probably much more effective than
Mhm.
having to have a philosophy class and try to decide that's what you
Oh,
think
oh yeah.
before you
No, no.
actually live it.
Yeah. If you start in that, and before you'll never get to actually doing anything.
Yeah, you never leave your house most likely, but um, but it is very interesting, that's for sure. Um,
Oh yeah.
yeah, so I think that that also goes into a little of how he breaks down question types, which I really personally very much appreciated because I
Mhm.
feel I with this podcast, you can imagine I read a fair number of books on divination in
Mhm.
addition to practicing it. And I am always talking to my friends and coven mates about how people don't spend enough time talking about question formation and the ways in which our
Yes.
question types interact with the way we read and the way we interpret.
Mhm.
And he
Mhm.
has a
Mhm.
beautifully
Mhm.
simple who, what, when, where, how little breakdown of
Mhm.
questions. And
Mhm.
yeah, it's really fantastic. I mean, if there's maybe something you want to say about how he thought about question formation and that
It
stuff, I
was
have some other thoughts, but
Yeah, it wasn't so much that he had a particular philosophy of question formation. It was simply that there were times where especially after he retired, because he did not have much of a pension. He worked as a reader, a telephone reader, doing tarot readings over the phone, and
yeah,
he had to do a lot of readings, bang, 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 bang. So part of that, in fact, a lot of what shaped all this was simply his experience with hundreds, thousands of tarot readings. Again, you need to group things to make it easy to work with, and having the questions nice, having it has a taxonomy of questions, and also a good sense of what well-formed and ill-formed questions are. So if the client asks a question that is confused or contradictory, or it's very clear they're not asking what they really want to know. When a woman nervously says, "Do you think I'll ever have children?" and it's very clear that what she's actually asking is, "Am I pregnant?"
yeah,
or
yeah,
am I about to get pregnant, or what have you, or guys are talking, different people have different fears, different places where they go, and they don't want to say what they're actually wanting to say. Very often that shows up in the form of an ill-formed question. And if you
yeah.
take a moment to talk to them and figure out what they actually want, or if they're actually trying to learn, it makes it so much easier to answer.
Yeah, yeah, because of his experience of that many readings, then being able to very quickly, not categorize, I don't want to make that sound like it's just boxing everything in, but
Hmm.
having those containers that help you get
Yeah,
quickly to the point of what someone needs to know.
yeah, yeah. Having a structure so you can help them, because I mean, many of us, and certainly as a working diviner, because that's something I've done primarily with geomancy. Um, Very often, once you can put the question clearly, the answer's obvious. And so much of what you have to do is help somebody find their way to the question. It's kind of like the Grail legend, where the thing that the knight has to do when he reaches the Grail castle isn't anything heroic. He has to ask the right question. Once he does that, everything changes and then the quest is completed. I
Yeah.
think that's a metaphor for our lives in a lot of ways. If we know what to ask,
Hmm.
we can getting to the answer is the easy part.
Absolutely. There's a quote I'm going to mangle, but it's essentially that like you should spend 90% of your time figuring out what the question is, and then you only need 10% of the time to answer it. You know what I mean?
Oh
It's
yeah,
that that is
and it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. It's because we don't ask the right question that we spend so much of our time blundering about. So yeah.
Mhm. Well, it also gets into, while he is incredibly practical and specific, which people should just read the book in order to see that
Mhm.
specificity in action, he
It's
does
it's short.
also.
It's short. It's reasonable. It's readable, and it will transform your tarot reading. Trust me. Go on.
Oh yeah, yeah, I completely agree. I will be recommending it to people certainly. Um,
Thank you.
he's still, and I like this, he makes sure that there's room in the way that he's talking about things, that it is not rigid. And one of the stories that I really liked in the book that I feel illustrated that really well was the story of someone losing their keys, and he's asking them, I mean, they're asking for help finding their keys. So they
Hmm.
come up with a system. He's excellent at describing, like, coming up with a system for what each of the
Hmm.
things in the reading will mean, and
Hmm.
then deciding based on the card that's drawn where the keys are. um,
Hmm.
it- of course, the keys don't end up being in the space that the card indicates, but while that person is in the spot looking there, they spontaneously remember where they placed the keys.
Where the key was, yes. So.
Exactly. And he mentions that this to some people might mean, oh, well, see, your reading wasn't accurate. And yet actually it was, from a
Hmm. It's
sideways logic type of perspective. And I
it.
really liked that.
The point was that the client got her keys back,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
that's the and yeah, it may be that something in that particular space um triggered the memory. Since
Yeah.
it's just um anything that works with divination, works with magic. Anybody who has experience with that knows that the universe is not a straightforward place, and that kind of roundabout way of doing things is actually quite common.
Oh, yeah. It's basically how the world works anyway. But yes, absolutely.
Hmm.
And I think
Yeah,
that
yeah.
making sure that there's room to remember that this stuff, like all magic, like you were saying, is also kind of the sideways logic,
Hmm. Hmm.
the upside down world a little bit. And so while being specific and having these rules, that you also have to have that other kind of logic going at the same
Hmm.
time to be able to
Again,
recognize.
it becomes co-creative. It's a co-creation between the world of logic and straightforward rules and the world of free-flowing intuition.
Yeah.
And those two can interact in very creative ways, as long as they're allowed to basically play together.
Hmm. Yeah. Then that idea of play, I think, comes through
Hmm.
strongly in this book as well, even with its rules. Like, the rules are there in order to facilitate that play, not to
Well, yeah,
limit
I
it.
mean, it's like any game. Any game has rules. Whether you're playing hopscotch, whether you're playing poker, whether you're playing chess, whether you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, there's always rules because
Yeah.
you need that structure to give a framework. It's the same way that your skeleton provides the rigid framework against your muscles can work and allow you to dance and jump and things.
Yeah. The frameworks are necessary for that creativity to happen.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. This is kind of a pet subject of mine because so many people um, in recent years have been so fixated on the idea that limits are always bad, and they're quite wrong. Of course, I mean, right now there is a chair that is limiting the tendency of my backside to land suddenly on the floor. I appreciate that limit. you know, there's a
Absolutely.
lot.
Yes.
There are a lot of useful limits in the world,
Hmm.
and it's a matter of do you set the limits to yourself? Do you work with them? Do you dance with them? Or do you spend all your time uselessly struggling against them when you could simply use them as something to push off against and have fun with them?
Well, yes, as a classical violinist, I
Okay,
completely
there you
agree. If
go.
you
Yeah.
don't have the technique, you can't have the artistry. So 100%. But our
Exactly.
culture doesn't
Exactly.
really particularly like Saturn and limits. So we've sort of been
No,
taught to hate
it's
those
too bad.
things.
But well, I mean, think of comedy. To do a really good comic routine, you got to have a straight man.
Yes,
So Saturn is the straight man of the cosmos. You know.
that's very true. I never thought about it from the comedy perspective, but yes. Um, So speaking of limits and sort of ways that we structure things, then
Hmm.
we've already mentioned, of course, he talks a great deal about how the most important thing is one card. First, can you just read a single card? And as you were
Hmm.
saying, you could get ridiculous amounts from one card. But he does
Hmm.
mention some spreads, and you do have some of those in the book.
Hmm.
Um, what would you say are some of your favorites that he would go to? I mean, of course, there's past, present, future. He has the elemental spread idea. Is there maybe one in particular that you could talk about to introduce people to his idea of it?
My my person the one that I worked with most when I was studying tarot with him was the 3 card spread. With you pass, which I didn't always use it as past, present, future. Basically any triadic structure, but very often it was this is the situation, which to some extent is the past. This is me in relation to it. This is the outcome that gives us the future. And all of this depends on being able to unpack a single card. And this is why he stressed learn how to do the 1 card reading first, because people will tend to skim over how much information you can get out of each card. But so you've got the 1 card representing this is the situation, this is what's given, this is what you have to work with. Okay. And there's everything in that card. John especially liked using the Rider Waite, although I don't think I ever saw him at a loss with any deck. But you've got let's say the 8 of Wands there. You've got these wands flying across the landscape or what have you, and every detail has something to teach you. So you can unpack that, and then you unpack this is the second. Here's the second card. We'll say it's the Magician, okay, and all of that tells you something about your position, about how you stand in relation to this environment, and then the third one being the most likely outcome. And one of the things that he stressed is that the future is not fixed. What this is saying is, given this background and your action, this is what will happen. If you don't want that outcome, you need to change your action.
Yeah.
And so it's very much, it's not a matter of predicting what will happen. It's exploring possibilities, looking at options, and you could do a whole series of them.
Mhm.
Saying, okay, what's going to happen if I choose this? What's going to happen if I choose that? What's going to happen if I choose that? That's 3 card readings. And in the process, you'll get a very clear idea of what's going down and how you can respond to it.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that just I am very much a fan of doing the either or one cards because, there's no reason to feel you have to smoosh everything into one question when you can divide things up. You don't need a
Oh
lot
yeah,
of
yeah,
cards. Yeah, so
yeah.
you can
Yeah.
do it with one card, but still have multiple questions helping guide you. So that's not
Yeah, exactly. And
the
if you
life
have a whole
university
series of
everything.
questions, you just deal 1 card after another, and you just bink, 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 bink. Yeah, you
Mhm.
can
Yeah.
really. And I also found it I find it very useful to kind of do sort of free form spreads as we go. Okay, here, I want to know about the situation, and there are these 3 possibilities relating to it. Here's my best action, and here's the outcome for which I'm striving. Okay, each of those is a card. Each of those is a position, and I can deal out 1 card for this and 1 card for each of the three possibilities, and so on and so forth, and just kind of make up a spread as I go. And I find very often that gives me nice, clear answers that are specific and to the point of what I'm looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. There is another aspect which I feel also kind of will help in the, later portion when we're going to talk a bit more about astrology, where in
Hmm.
this book, he talks about tarot dignities, and the idea
Hmm.
of what cards mean when they are in various positions related to other cards.
Hmm.
Uh, could you give us just an example of what's tarot dignities are?
Well, there are various schemes of it, but for example, it's quite often in some of the older tarot reading methods that if cards are together with other cards of their same suit, they're strengthened. If you have, say, again, this is, of course, here we're in multiple card spreads, but if you have a wand and it's near another wand, or a wand and it's near another sword, because both fire and air are active elements, they strengthen each other. If you have a wand next to a cup, fire and water don't get along so well, and so they weaken or they come into conflict with each other. That's one of those things that the Golden Dawn, of course, took to extremes. It did so much in its divinatorial and its teachings generally, but it can be very useful just to get a sense of what, how does this fit? How do these cards fit in their environment? Sometimes John would advise using some kind of very relatively formal system of, like, the elements or what have you. And sometimes he would just say, well, keep your eye on how does this work? When you have the Eight of Wands next to the Devil, you've got some conflict there, because the Devil is such a card of stuckness, and the Eight of Wands is this card of free flying movement. Those are not going to get together too well. And so you're going to have a conflict between that quality of stuckness and that desire to move. So that's
Yeah, I
one
think
of the ways that dignity can operate.
and I think that's also a good point because perhaps sometimes, when people hear dignities, they may immediately go into astrology, which is wonderful. And the idea of astrological dignities and all of that is important and excellent. But you can also, even if you're not going from the astrological perspective, or having a formalized system, you can just look at the cards again, and see, would these characters interact well? Would they enjoy each other's company? If not, perhaps this is not these energies are not going to work well together, or they're pointing to some imbalance or conflict in the situation between two things that are opposed or not happy next to one another.
Yeah, not happy next to one another. And then one can take that and say, okay, this is going to reflect something going on in the aspect of your life that deals with this question. And yeah, it can really reveal a lot to you.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and I think very important as a reminder for people, especially if you are going to do more than one card, that aspect of looking at spreads is also valuable, and that's outside of just the context of, I have a formal meaning for what the third card means, and the fourth card means this. It's also just, how do they look when they're down? How do they look when they're next to each other? And what conversation are they having?
Yeah. You have, what you have here are 78 personalities, 78 characters. And think of it as a really complex story, where you can have up to 78 characters getting involved in this complicated cocktail party or what have you. How are they going to interact? Who is on speaking terms with whom? Who is irritated at whom? Who is going to throw a hissy fit?
Yes. Yeah.
I have to say that one of the more interesting things that I've ever seen done with tarot cards is, I've known several people who used them as the basis for plotting fiction. They would assign a card to each of their characters, and when they were stuck for what was going to happen, they'd lay out a spread and see who showed up and how they were interacting. And even when they didn't, they had that anchor for the character and the personality, so they could get a sense of, okay, these two are not going to get along.
Sorry, the mute was stuck for a second.
Oh,
yes, and I'm trying to rack my brains. There's a famous short novel, by a very famous author, and it's going to really bother me that I can't remember what it's called. Well, I will think of it and I will put it in the show notes, and I'm sure you know it, but because I can't think of the name, it's just going to bother me now. But in any case, yeah, the idea that they are characters and how those characters interact with one another, even in the space of a reading around a question, is also something that has that intuitive capacity for where we are bringing something to the table and then looking at what they are just showing us sitting in front of us. So, but that is also kind of, so we're touching on intuition, which I have another question I want to ask you about, John Gilbert's views of intuition and how he described it, I think, very succinctly. Um, but this idea of having consistency in terms of interpretation, I really liked that he emphasized the idea of saying that, let's say you decide what reversals are going to mean in
Hmm.
a certain context with a certain deck. That's what it means.
Hmm.
That's how you're going to read reversals. Or you're going to decide, I don't read reversals. I don't pay attention to them. You know what I mean? But that whatever it is, whatever decision you make is the one that you will stick with. And that idea of
Hmm.
consistency in how you work
Hmm.
with reversals or dignities or anything like that.
Hmm.
How do you feel with that idea of consistency? Because I believe he says that he thinks that you should only have consistency within one deck. So you could theoretically, if you work with three different decks, have different sets of rules that you work with based on the deck. But how do you think that comes out in practice?
Well, I find, practically speaking, having a consistent system, first of all, um, it's very useful in that you don't have to flounder around trying to figure out what any given thing means. Here we
Mhm.
have such
Yeah.
and such card up. Here we have the Six of Cups reversed. Okay, so having a consistent system in place, that the six means one thing and the cups means one thing and the reversal means one thing. You can put those together. That gives you the basic framework within which your intuition can function. And I've always found that very useful. I'm sure there are people who do not. There's no such thing as one right way for everybody. But for very many people, just having that simple framework, you don't even have to really think about it. You've learned it, you've committed it to memory. It pops up immediately when you need it, and that just makes for much simpler divination. And it also, again, it provides that framework within which the intuition can play. And also, of course, there's a simple fact that if John is right, that the subconscious mind is mediating, whether whether it's mediating relations to, say, deities, or whether whatever is going on here, the subconscious mind it tends to be very stuck in its ways, and if you change things on it too often, it can get confused.
Mhm.
So
No.
you want
Yeah.
to have, it is to some extent. There were a lot of occultists back, say, 100 years ago, who believed the subconscious mind was centered in the solar plexus. And the solar plexus is about the size of it's a lump of nerve tissue about the size of a cat's brain. I've taken to calling it your onboard cat. And so, you can think of your subconscious as your unborn, as your onboard cat. Okay, it is there. It is, but it has, it doesn't necessarily have that nimble a mind. It remembers lots of stuff, and it can respond. But you want to give it some nice, steady, stable guidelines to work with, so that it doesn't get too confused.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I think then speaks back to the idea of making sure that whatever system and ways we're interacting with these divination tools are simple enough, especially at
Hmm.
first, so that we're not
Yeah,
overcomplicating things for
we're
our
not we're not
conscious
make
mind or our subconscious.
yeah, we're not making things too complex for the onboard cat to figure out any, whatever it is interacting with, other than ourselves. We can leave that. But I think it's quite valid to say that it serves in a mediating function. And yeah, having a nice simple framework just makes things easier for everybody.
Mhm. Yeah.
You want your onboard cat to purr at you, not to hiss and snarl.
Oh, most definitely. That's very important. Um, and I think that connects to the concepts of the intuition, which
Hmm.
very straightforwardly he describes, and I'm very much in agreement that people speak a lot about developing their intuition, and well, I'm we know what they mean by that. He is very quick to point out that it is really just more about distinguishing or discerning it as opposed to
Yeah,
developing it.
yeah. I mean,
And
it's there.
yeah,
It's there. We don't have to develop it. It's right there. The point is learning to listen to it.
that's the development. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We have to develop ourselves so that we
Mm,
can we can shut up and listen to the voice of intuition.
mhm.
It's the immortal in the immortal words of King Arthur from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Shut up! Shut up!
Oh, I thought you were going to go with the how do you know he's the king? But no.
No, we'll pass on that one.
Yes, exactly. But speaking of how do you know he's the king, I like that he mentions that one of the keys to answering the question of, well, am I making this up, or am I imagining the answer versus, hearing it from my intuition, is the idea that our intuitive voice is one that is less invested in whether something is good or bad. So it has that
Hmm.
more of a neutral tone and feel to it. And when we are really
Hmm.
connected into that, I think it's a very important point for people to kind of get the feel of. And when you
Hmm.
start
Hmm.
being able to connect to that easier, you can start to then feel that connection to something which doesn't have the same type of value judgments or very extreme emotions
Yeah,
around it.
yeah. It is quiet. It is calm. It is. It doesn't. It isn't invested in being right, and it's especially not invested in other people being wrong. And that's
Yeah.
especially in a time like this one where so many people are so caught up in very much in that I am the good guy and these other people who disagree with me are bad. That's unproductive at the best of times, but it particularly gets in the way of any kind of intuitive awareness because once you've locked your ego into um, that kind of fixation on the rightness of your own opinions, it's a mess.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's extremely true. So I would imagine that what you just said would be part of the answer to what my next question is, which is, um, of course, with this book and the other that you've edited of his works, and being able to have, learned from him, and been a colleague of his, what do you feel are some of the enduring pieces of his philosophy or his views on these things that you would want people to kind of most immediately be aware of or sort of bring into their practice?
Okay. The first thing that I think probably the most important thing is the realization there ain't no such thing as one right way for everybody. What works for you. That's great. It does not necessarily work for anybody else in the world. There's a real tendency in our society to believe that if something works for me, I've got to go out and push it on everybody else because it's the right thing. You see this with diets, you see this with politics, you see it with everything. But in fact, each of us is different. Each of us has our own way of relating to the divine, of relating to the various transcendent forces that shape our cosmos. And what works for the individual, any individual, is going to be at least somewhat unique. So that was a crucial thing about his teaching, and as I'm sure you realize, it informed his tarot practice from top to bottom. Another very important point is exactly that sense of the importance of intuition, the importance of stepping back from our opinions, stepping back from um, our emotional commitments, our anger, or our self righteousness, or any of these, or our irritation at people who we dislike. Just stepping back from that and quieting. He really put a lot of focus into the need for a little daily meditation of some kind. He taught several different kinds of meditation, but he said you should do some of this every day just to cut down on the inner chatter and listen for a change. The world is full. One of his teachings. The world is full of marvelous things, and it's full of information. It's full of insights and wisdom and knowledge. But we actually have to listen to it instead of spending our time trying to tell it what to do. Um, One of the other things that he tended to stress. Um, we live in a society that is oddly hostile to individual achievement. Our schools, our jobs are very focused on having most of us behave like cogs in a machine. You're supposed to come out as a standardized product from the schooling system, get plugged into place in some job or other, and just go thunk, ka-thunk, ka-thunk in a mechanical fashion for the rest of your days. We have this cult of certain people who have quote talent unquote, who are they're the one they're the they're the wizarding folk as opposed to the rest of us muggles. They're the talented ones, the special ones. And all in the intention of keeping us thinking that, well, there's nothing we can do except for just trudging mechanically onward in whatever role has been assigned us by society. But what John pointed out is that every single human being has a capacity for magnificence, not just adequacy, not just getting by, but actual magnificence, actual splendor. We all have some capacity. No two of us have exactly the same capacity. But because the universe is always trying to communicate with us, because our intuition is always listening, because we have these avenues that even though we've forgotten how to use them, we can tap into that capacity for magnificence that is in each and every one of us. But we each have to do it for ourselves. Nobody else can do it for you. Nobody else can open that door. You have to do it for yourself, and that requires, on the one hand, a willingness to listen, and on the other hand, a willingness to set aside your existing opinions, especially your judgments and your negative judgments about yourself. Also, some of the positive ones sometimes can get in the way. You find people who are so fixated on the idea that they have talent A that they've never noticed that they have talents X, Y, and Z over on one side, and some of those may be more important. So I'd say those are probably crucial points in John's philosophy that things that showed up all through his various kinds of teaching, and they offer, I think, a very different way of looking at the world than many people are into at this point, and they offer some possibilities for changing the world by changing ourselves, by actually embracing that capacity for magnificence that we each have. That we are all capable of more than we let ourselves believe, and it's when we allow ourselves to achieve what we can that the world becomes a more interesting place.
Absolutely. And that's very beautifully put. Thank you. I there was a statement that he had, I can't remember which part of the book, but I clipped it out just so that I can read it, and I'll just read a portion of it, where he's talking about doubt and the work that goes into this. It's easy for me to doubt the cards even after 40 some years of reading them. It's easy for me to let my prejudices get in the way of doing a reading. It is work for me to remember the cards will always tell me the truth. It's work for me to remember the cards always give me better answers than my own ideas. As a professional, it's work I must do each and every reading. So that idea of also having faith, that yes, we can create, we can do this, we have that magnificence that is
We
possible.
have that, but
But
each
it's
of us
also
has
very
to keep.
affirming to hear that someone who has been doing it for 40 some years, of course, has the humility and the self-knowledge to be able to admit, yes, this is still work. Yes, I still have to do this every day and acknowledge this as difficult.
Yeah, I imagine that Mozart probably got up in the morning, every morning before he went over to start, composing some new musical masterpiece. He had to wrestle with the same thing. He had to set his own ideas aside. He had to deal with his doubt. He had to realize, his musical intuition would guide him if he only listened to it.
Yeah,
That's part of the way that we are capable of embracing our magnificence. Again, that capacity to listen instead of clutching our own ideas and trying to tell the universe what to do and what to be.
Yes. And seeing
the whole
what
point
comes of that is very different, certainly.
Yeah. So the whole point of divination is that it's a way of listening.
Yep.
And it's an extremely valuable tool for learning to listen, learning to intuit, learning to pay attention to the intuitive sense that every single one of us has. It's just we have to get out of our own way. And whether tarot cards or whatever other oracle you choose to use, those can be, those are effective ways to do that.
Oh, absolutely. I could not agree more. And developing that capacity to listen and making space for it, though, that's the trick sometimes. So yeah.
Oh yeah.
It is. I mean, there's so much we can talk about with just tarot alone that but I do want to touch a little bit on the mundane astrology aspect of what you have been doing lately, because I know that there's a lot of excitement building. You have a Patreon now that's focused on astrological forecasts and world politics, and you have a book coming out at the end of January, The
That's
Astrology
correct.
of Nations, Casting and Interpreting Charts for Nations, Politics, and Economies. which
Yes.
I will, put a link to pre-ordering and, of course, to the Patreon in the show notes. But
Thank you.
speaking of how divination helps us navigate both our own lives and our questions, but it is also,
Hmm.
of course, involved in navigating world events and the
Hmm.
larger topics of mundane astrology. So we will talk in more detail about these things, I'm sure, in a couple of months once the book has been out.
Hmm.
But can you maybe just give us a brief little intro for those who may not know to what mundane
Okay,
astrology is?
sure. Since the astrological revival of the 1960s brought astrology back into general attention, most people know about natal astrology. They know about birth charts of individuals. And many of them don't know that there's anything else. In fact, there are a whole series of different branches of astrology that deal with different ways that you can use the messages of the heavens to interpret events on Earth. And the oldest of all is political astrology, or as it's called formally, mundane astrology, mundane meaning of the world. Okay. If you go back to the earliest astrological records we have, clay tablets from Sumer, they're all focused on politics. They're all recording what happened in the sky, what happened on Earth, and trying to draw connections between them. And so mundane astrology has about a 5,000-year track record behind it at this point. There are various ways to do it. The methods that I've used were the standard methods through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the early modern period. Um, Basically, they focus not on anybody's birth chart, not on the birth charts of nations, but on ingress charts. You cast an ingress chart for the moment of each of the 4 quarters of the year, the moment that the sun enters Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn, for the location of the national capital. And that actually gives you a snapshot of what's going to happen for 3 or 6 or 12 months thereafter, depending on what kind of rising, so whether it's a cardinal only rules, if a cardinal sign is rising, that only rules for 3 months, fixed or mutable gives you 6 months, and fixed gives you a full year. And so you have these various things. Each house has a particular meaning, and the planets each have political meanings as well. And you can actually get a snapshot, not of specific events, but of the kind of tone, if you will, the astrological weather that events have to go through. It's very good for economic issues. If you have malefic planets in the second house, the economy is going to suck. If the ruler of the second house is in a good aspect to the sun or something like that, then you're likely to have an economic boom. And so all these things interact. It's quite complex, but I've actually been doing it. Let's see, I have a Patreon. I also have an account on Subscribestar for those who don't like using Patreon. Um, they carry the same predictions, and I post ingress charts. I post charts for eclipses. Eclipses are kind of a downer because in traditional mundane astrology, eclipses are always bad omens. Solar eclipse, lunar eclipse, does not matter. If you have an eclipse, that tells you what kind of trouble you're going to be in for the next, few months or years. Keep in mind, most of history is a chronicle of trouble. History books do not have a lot of happy things in them. And so mundane astrology responds appropriately. Then you also finally have outer planet conjunctions, especially the great conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn, but also since the discovery of Uranus and Neptune. Those conjunctions also play with like Saturn and Jupiter. Those conjunctions also play a very important role, which we are still working out. Give us 5,000 years, we'll have it all worked out.
Yeah,
But
give
so
or take a
all of these,
thousand. Yeah.
exactly, give or take. Well, the thing is, astrology is an empirical science. It is not based on theory, it's based on experience. We know that certain things happen, certain things mean this or that in a political sense, because over all this span of time, when you have an ingress chart and there's Jupiter in the second house, whoa, the economy is going to do better than you think, because it does. So it started out just as an experiment, but it has done quite well. I've also done research into some older events and cast the relevant charts to them and found, oh, look at those connections. Look how that predicted this. Part of the work of blowing the dust off this ancient and very interesting branch of astrology and getting it into circulation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of the history of mundane astrology in this particular talk, but I am curious for people who may not know the history as well. Like it basically this practice of you've already mentioned, of course, it's extremely ancient, obviously,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
it fell out of favor and is only recently sort of been reawakening. And I am very
Yeah,
glad that you were helping bring attention to it. Especially for someone like
and
me, I
there.
do not call myself an astrologer, but I am fascinated with it and appreciate
Hmm.
the time and effort people are putting to bring some
Yeah.
of this back and sort of update it in that sense.
When
Um,
we have the future conversation about the book, I can tell you exactly why mundane astrology dropped out of favor. It's kind of
mm,
it's not really a good story.
yeah.
But fortunately, that's all past, and we can now take this ancient and effective technique for getting a sense of the political and economic weather of the future, and put it to use.
Mhm.
It's interesting stuff, and yeah, I have a book coming out. I have these things. I'm actually working on another book on astrology right now on a different astrological topic. I've been in well, I set aside astrology when I was young, when I was in my teens, and I started getting into occultism. I looked at the sheer volume of astrological lore, and I said, that's something for me to take up when I get to middle age. Right now, I'm going to focus on ceremonial magic and practical occultism. Okay, well, time passed, and it would have been about 15 years ago. I think I looked at myself in the mirror, saw the gray hair, and say, okay, I think I'm middle aged. Time to start learning astrology. And from then on, it's been a subject of increasing interest to me. There's a lot to be learned from it.
No, absolutely. So, in a sense, because we're going to have a larger conversation about kind of the techniques and the tools of it at a later date, but I am very curious to see you have just posted on your Patreon a little bit about the ingress for the United States, and I'm sorry, I am going to bias this conversation to the U.S. just because of time and where I'm located, and a lot
Oh
of
yeah,
people who listen here.
I bet.
Uh,
Well, I do charts for the United States and for Great Britain. There, you can do a chart for any country in the world, and I strongly encourage anyone who's interested to do charts for their own country. But I live here.
Absolutely.
I have a lot of friends in Britain. That's as much as I have time to do.
Yeah.
So yes, we can be very USO-centric here if you want to be.
Sadly for this conversation, sure. Um, so is there, and I feel like this will also kind of help people ground what we're talking about in something that is
Hmm.
practical. If you could walk us through a little bit of what you see in the first few months of what's going on
Just a
with
little bit. Yeah,
mundane
we're
astrology in
looking.
the next couple of months.
Okay, the first thing to look at is that we're facing serious wrenching transformations. The ingress chart for the Capricorn ingress on the 21st of this month is it has an aspect pattern known as a grand cross. So you have four planets that are at 90-degree angles for each other. They form each planet forms squares with two of the planets in opposition with the third. So we that's an explosive pattern. That means a lot of things are going to change in a hurry. Um, and it means it will be relatively wrenching, it's going to shake things up very considerably. Given where the planets are located, there are going to be changes, obviously major changes in government, major changes in state governments, major changes in foreign policy, and simply in the general attitude of the American people. Um, it's going to be a wild ride. According to the chart, we do not have to worry about going to war during this 3 month period. Okay. What happens after that? We'll discuss. I'll be discussing that in a future reading. This one's just for 3 months. But given the planets that are active in the seventh house, which is the house of war, we're going to dodge that bullet. Whatever nonsense is going on in Ukraine and in the Middle East right now, there are plenty of bombs falling, plenty of bullets flying there. The U.S. is not going to be directly involved in it, so that's one source of comfort. Um, Generally speaking, it's gonna there are some indications of serious economic trouble. There's some problems with the second house. There are some problems with the eighth house, which deals with foreign trade and investment. And there's also down in the sixth, I think it's Mars is associated in the sixth house. I don't have the chart with me right at the moment, but there are indications that suggest this is going to be a bad season for flu or some other infectious feverish disease. So take extra care of your health during this time, and if you can avoid the kind of places where you're likely to pick up a bug, this might be a good idea to do it.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. And I think that what you just said there, that kind of speaks to why this can be helpful from people,
Oh, it could
because
be,
it's
yeah.
not just about like, oh, well, I suppose I could make my stock picks based on this, which I mean, you could,
Well,
but it's
now,
also kind of how are you orienting
yeah.
yourself to the
Oh,
wider things
there's
that are
a
happening in
there's
society.
an entire field of financial astrology out there,
Uh-huh.
which I am not into yet. People literally, I mean, um,
Oh, yeah.
J.P. Morgan, who is, I think, America's first billionaire back more than a century ago. He had a very simple comment about astrology, which he practiced. He said, "Millionaires don't use astrology; billionaires do."
Hmm. Yeah.
So he was a client of Evangeline Adams, who was one of the great American astrologers of the turn of the last century. Um, and that's he always credited the advice he got from her for his amazing financial success. But that's not what I'm doing here. Certainly, though, if you're looking at a period of economic trouble, this is not a time to gamble. This is maybe you want to kind of pull some money gently out of your investments and stick it in someplace more secure. It's likely to be, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, a lot of instability. So yeah, people can pay attention to that. In my readings, in my delineations, I actually go through each house because many of the houses refer to specific sectors of the economy, especially on the lower half of the chart. So if you know that, for example, media, transport, and internet firms are going to get shellacked this time, you've got like Saturn in that house, and it's ruled by Uranus, and Uranus is in bad aspect. You look at that, and say, I think I'm going to rotate some of my money out of that. If you happen to have investments, you can rotate some of your money out of that sector into something more stable. Or if there's if there's a really good good planets ruling the fourth house, then it might be time to go long on real estate.
Yeah.
So just one of those things. It is very practical.
I'm going to do my little end of commercial thingy, which is, all investments involve risk. Please use caution when
Yeah, exactly.
making
Do
decisions
not.
based on financial
I
advice.
am. I am not. I am not a licensed investment counselor. I do not. I do not get your past performance is no guarantee of future results. And
All
yeah,
those other statements that need to be made. Sure,
all
exactly.
those other necessary statements. This is basically my advice is if cast the charts or cast and interpret the charts yourself, or follow along with mine, but watch how those interact with the markets and make your own judgments, come to your own opinion. It's again the same thing. There ain't no one right way for everybody.
Absolutely. But it is all about then having what I also really appreciate about mundane astrology is I think that it kind of helps to pull the view much further out. So if we are used to being sort of inundated by news reports and ways of interacting with world affairs that are blatantly designed to trigger our emotions and have us
Mm-hmm.
essentially be manipulated by whatever sort of emotional reactions they want to
Uh-huh.
get. Of course, I'm
Uh-huh.
sure there are people reporting absolutely seriously, doing the absolute best diligent practices, but then there's still the emotional component that can make people get too
Mm-hmm.
invested in these small things.
Oh,
And mundane astrology can help us pull back and see the larger
yeah.
cycles in play.
Among other things, mundane astrology is a great corrective to the kind of utopian craving that so many people have, especially in our modern society. So many people have this craving for everything to go right. If only my candidate or my party wins, life will be wonderful. Well, no, it probably won't. It may be okay. There will be ups and downs. Life is like that. And mundane astrology, particularly, I tend to put a little focus into the trouble side of things simply because that's what people need to be warned about. And so, instead of being convinced that, if only Kamala Harris or if only Donald Trump wins, we'll go into a marvelous, wonderful world. Well, no. It's going to have the same problems that it had, under the previous president, the president before then. And so, to some extent, some people say, well, what a downer. But I mean, if you look back over the course of your life since you became aware of politics, and if you placed high hopes on this president or that president or this party or that party, how has that worked for you?
Yeah.
Mundane astrology offers something that is based on experience. It is based on, this is the way things happen. And so I think it can help us calm down and stop. And of course, there's the flip side of it. The number of people, I mean, every election, every 4 years, whoever loses the presidential, oh God, we're going to be a fascist country in 3.2 seconds. They'll be goose stepping down the street any minute now. The Republicans say that of the Democrats say that of the Republicans. And you know what? The goose stepping armies just are not showing up. And at some point, mundane astrology will help you go, no, it was just an ordinary election deal.
Wait, you mean that it was not the most important of all history until the next one, which will be the most important of all history, and then the next one?
Every election is the most important election of your lifetime. People are joking about that at this point.
Yeah, at least we are joking about it, so that is good.
Yeah, well, it's sooner or later, no matter how shrill you make the propaganda, sooner or later, people just start giggling because it's just the same thing every 4 years. So yeah, and mundane astrology with its 5,000-year, track record and memory is just looking at this whole thing, going, children, calm down.
Well, yeah. Easier said than done, but at the same time, yes. Is there anything else in particular about this, this ingress that you think would be interesting for people to know, since we're approaching when the inauguration, the actual transition of power will be? Is there anything else that you might want to put in there?
It's likely the whole thing is likely to go much more smoothly than most people think. I mean, so far we've already had some of that. There was all the insistence that whichever side lost was going to riot and blah blah blah, and you notice that it's all been fairly calm.
Yeah.
And one of the things that the ingress chart says is that, yes, there will be wrenching change, but it's not going to be a crisis. It's going to work out. So we just need to kind of catch our breath and stop hyperventilating and go on. That's kind of that's kind of the one of the major points that I think is important to remember at this point. This is just another election. The Donald Trump, the king in orange, is just another politician.
Absolutely.
He's not. He is not the God Emperor of humanity. He is not Satan incarnate, cackling and polishing his gold-plated horns. He's just another politician.
Absolutely. And then that ties back into what we were saying earlier about how divination is not just, obviously, mundane astrology has its historical basis, that 5,000 years or so helps to put it in a broader context, which does kind of, by necessity, calm the situation down if you can see it in something that's clearly much bigger than your lifetime. But all forms of divination kind of should be doing the same thing of helping you see those patterns that are larger than just the question. Even if you are asking one question, it's still kind of relating to other things and helping you take that time.
Yeah. It all echoes outward, and yeah. One of the things that I've always found amusing is that whenever when somebody has not had their first tarot deck long, with the first time they deal death, and they panic. I've seen it dozens and dozens of times. I get frantic emails sometimes from people who've just gotten their first tarot deck, and death came up in a reading, and they're going, "Oh my God, oh my God!" And you have to talk them down and explain that There are only 78 cards. Your chances of getting any one of them if you do daily readings, you're going to have that card come up
Yeah.
fairly
Yeah.
often. And no, it doesn't mean you're going to die 11 times in the next 16 months.
Yeah. Or the first time they get to tower, that's also a
Mhm.
shock.
Yeah,
But the
that's a
tower's
good
on
one. Yeah.
fire. What's happening?
Yeah, exactly. Or the Ten of Swords is another one that sometimes gets a good lurid freak out, especially if it's a
Yeah.
Rider Waite style deck with the guy playing human pincushion on it.
No.
Yeah,
There's a Pagan Cats tarot deck that I got as a gift from a friend. I've now been using it last few months because I love it so much. And it's kind of cutesy, but at the same time, the tower is phenomenal. I'll
Hmm.
include a photo of it actually, sort of in the show notes if I can get a link to it, because it's so visceral. There's a cat that's falling from the tower, and it's as if the cat is falling towards the camera of the artist. So you just see the
Wow.
cat's face. But it's also beautiful because since it's pagan cats, it's probably going to land on its feet. So there's sort of a nice thing about it being a cat where I'm like, well, it is the tower. It's still not good, but cats land on their feet. So it all depends on
Hmm.
what's around it and how you're dealing with
Hmm.
it.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
But yes. So I really appreciate your time with all of this, and I appreciate all that you are putting into the just to my mind, frankly, an inconceivable number of books and posts and things that you write all the time, which I am so
Well, thank you.
grateful
I like to write, and
for.
since I've been writing since I was a fairly small child. Yeah, I can do it fairly quickly nowadays.
Mhm. Is there I love to ask this at the end of interviews. Is there any particular piece of advice or thought that you'd like to leave listeners with at this time? Something you want to
Yeah,
share?
I want to cycle back to that point about the fact that each of us has the capacity for magnificence. I'd like to encourage all of the listeners to just stop and listen for a moment to the inevitable back talk that you're going to get from inside your mind, saying, "Oh no, I can't have any magnificence in me. I'm just a perfectly ordinary person." And stop. Set that aside and just allow the possibility that you have a capacity for magnificence that maybe you've never explored. You may have talents you don't know about. There may be possibilities for your life as we move on through this period of wrenching change that you've never dreamed of. So, open your mind, be a little more intuitive, quiet the chatter, and see what surfaces. See whether there's something you might want to explore in the new year that um, will open some new doors for you.
Yeah, that's very beautiful. Thank you for that. So,
Thank you.
well, I will have all the links. Oh, let me just ask, is there anything besides the Patreon and this book, anything else that you want to call people's attention to about what
Well, the
you are?
Patreon, I do again want to give equal billing to subscribestar.com because I
Oh,
also
of
have
course, yeah. And I
the
will
thing
have
on
both
that.
links, of course. Yeah.
And the book. Other than that, just you'll have my blog and my Dream With journal,
Yes.
and I also have my bookshop on bookshop.org, I think it is. At any rate, I'll make sure you have the address of that. And that's
Yep.
anybody in the United States wants to buy books. It's a nice discount place that has, it pays the authors better than that big slimy river place. So
Mhm. Mhm. Yes, excellent. Then that's where I will be linking to for the show notes, definitely.
thank you very much.
Mhm.
Much appreciated.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, and I can't wait to read your next book and to have you on to talk about that again. So for now, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate being on. I had a great conversation.
Black moon above, stars overhead. Don't you dare guide me back to my bed. The river is frozen.